how do we how do we rethink sociality? So when it comes to Adivasis, I think the discourse is very much about marginalization, historic marginalization, the PISA, the Forest Rights Act. And yes, this is true. But I think that these kinds of relationships of domination, subordination, they also always go around alongside processes of some kind of mutuality and negotiation. I think this is debatable. We could debate it, but I take this very much from the work of James Scott, that there is weapons of the weak. I mean, there is domination, but there is also the art of resisting domination. So I think with Adivasi, somehow this aspect of agency or resistance, I mean, it comes out as movements, but I think it's always sort of the mainstream discourse has been one of subordination. And the third aspect, which I already mentioned also, has is the collective dimension, the community rights, the collectives. I think these are much more emphasized than individual rights to land and property. And I think this is somewhat romanticized. I mean, there is some collective thing, but I think this has got really diluted today. And it has become a competition with increases in population, with sort of land titling and revenue records and things like that, and the whole revenue system. There has been a much more focus towards individual rights. But I think, again, in the discourse, this is not acknowledged. So when I was doing my work, Supreme Court judgment in favor of two Adivasi women from Jharkhand, which said that who were not being denied, who were being denied land, and they said that they were widows, and in order to survive and make a livelihood, they needed the land. And when the Supreme Court judgment came in their favor, all the leaders of Jharkhand, that was pre-Jharkhand, but they got together, they really opposed it, and they said, no, Supreme Court is trying to destroy our collective, and so on. So I think there's a real tension here between community rights and individual rights, that individual rights you really can't speak about very much, particularly in terms of women. So I think, how does this change in the context of the changing political economy? So I think, as I said already, that land relations, of course, this is the old sort of political economy Marxian axiom, are social relations, but they also contribute to constructing identity. So, as already indicated, for men, the annual hunt becomes a space for building male solidarity, asserting identity as chasahod or as cultivators. And I think you have these typical images of men and plowing the land and so on. And even in terms of Bengal and other provinces, the person who plowed was seen as the landowner, because that was seen as a very critical activity. Well, women are very much engaged in cultivation, particularly in eastern India, in paddy cultivation, we know, but they locally are called or referred to within the community as Odahod, or people of the house, persons of the home. So they do make labor contributions to how agriculture and production systems, but somehow these are seen as an extension of domestic work, or as a part of household responsibilities, rather than as a part of productive work. And therefore, they continue to be excluded from land titles. And I think, if interested in the discussion, I can say a little bit more about this, because the UN has declared actually 2026 as the International Year of the Woman Farmer. But it's very interesting to see the kind of discourses again that are taking place around this, with very little movement on the ground. So land continues to remain embedded uh, sort of within kinship relations. And here I just wanted to give the story of another woman whom I was close to, and I'm calling her Sona. She lost her husband also in October 1997. She had 6 daughters, but she then tried to claim the land because she had these 4 daughters. 2 were married and 4 were unmarried, in order to make ends meet, the 2 acres of land. But of course, the male kin then were very unhappy with it. They tried to get her out of the land, they harassed her, and so on. So she tried a range of strategies, including sort of getting the support from 2 of her sons-in-law, because 2 of her older daughters were married, to help with plowing, because the local community ensured that no man would come to plow her land. And as a woman, she couldn't do it, and she only had daughters. But when all this was not really succeeding very much, and there was, they started calling her a witch, they did all sorts of harassment. She did have to go to file a case also in the local law court. Of course, this is also problematic because I think it does create a threat to the local kin, and they kept quiet for a little while. But of course, it's very, as we know, it's very difficult to get justice, and it's a very long drawn process, including in courts. I think the role it plays is more as a threat factor. So I think thinking about how both power and identities, power relations and identities negotiated, I think a couple of sort of, for me, conceptual starting points have been that women's rights to land, as I illustrated just now, they don't operate in a vacuum but are socially embedded. And they definitely are located within their intersecting identities. And I think what was very interesting here is that while Sona, for example, made a claim for that 2 acres of land, actually her husband's brothers' wives, or the women in the, in the in-laws household, they were not interested in giving her the land either. So they also opposed her, because these are very small plots of land with large households. So people are looking for, their immediate nuclear family. And I think this again sort of brings into stark contrast this gap between sort of the discursive level, where we're talking about communities when we talk about Adivasis, but actually some of these land relations operate very much at a local, household, individual, personal level. I think the second thing which has been interesting for me is that, women's roles and men's roles have been shifting, but how are these really valued? So as I just said, women have always contributed to the productive. Now with male migration, they're almost single-handedly taking care of agriculture. There is quite a large feminization visible, and therefore this has become very important. The meanings are changing, but at the same time, this labor contribution of productive labor doesn't seem to entitle them to rights to land. Whereas for men, it's kind of taken for granted that they are farmers and that they will have land titles. So I think this is the dynamics of this change are very interesting. The third point is really that a power, of course, is closely related to the material and social reproduction of societies. And here I use Habermas' conception to look at the material and social reproduction of societies taking place in the private realm, of course, but equally spanning across the public realm, and the interconnections between what Habermas calls the system or the public and the life worlds or the private realms as really being interconnected and mutually constitutive. And I'll give you an example of this later on, that when it comes to women, we try to separate out these and just whatever they do, put it into the private realm. But of course, they are also reproducing their households and societies through this engagement between the public and the private. Quite an important, I think, concept for me in this process of social reproduction is the social construction of difference, and of, how do you see women as a group as being subordinate to men as a group, and this becomes very critical. So as Risman says, stereotypes play a powerful role as devices of marginalization. So you have these stereotypes of, migrants as or Adivasis as, backward or as labor, or of women as, like Spivak says, can the subaltern speak, women unable to speak, not having agency, or as I wrote in my first book, the title was Good Women Do Not Inherit Land. And it was really about what is good. If women don't claim, then they are seen somehow as following this social norm of being obedient, etc. And they're seen as good. And I think there's a lot of discourse around, witches and witch hunting, or sort of some kind of attacks or controls over women who actually do exercise agency. And finally, sorry, and of course this entails then multiple competing interests, but also multiple sites of engagement, right from the household up to the state level. And as Nancy Fraser says, this opens up multiple publics or multiple spaces for the exercise of agency. And of course contestation becomes central to securing material needs and social reproduction. And I think this is so sort of fundamental to sort of social reproduction, contestation, in terms of different people's needs and how these are negotiated. So, when you now see a political context where you want no contestation or no dissidence, I think it kind of challenges the whole sort of conceptualization of, how we understand the reproduction of societies. So I think just a very brief on social reproduction and the work of stereotypes in everyday life. And this, starting with Engels, who talked about, devaluation of reproduction led to the subordination of women. So you create a stereotype that women are reproduce and therefore they are subordinate. And then in the 80s and 70s, you had the domestic labor debate. And it's very interesting that even at this time, the radical feminists like Silvia Federici and others, they kind of emphasized gender difference because they said, why should women become like men or seek to become have the same as men? They were against sameness. They argued for difference as legitimate. But of course, when you do this, then it becomes imperative to distinguish between the different kinds of domestic labor, the different kinds of reproductive work, which is biological, daily, as well as social reproduction. And social reproduction, the term is very broad because it includes intergenerational care and domestic work, food security, nutrition security, but it also includes this larger public domain or public realm of Habermas of reproduction of social institutions, culture, productive economy. And also, I think nowadays, much more, there's a big debate around sort of, well, not only now, between sort of gender and the environment, or sort of nature and the human and the non-human domain, and the material and the non-material. So the relationship between labor and land, but also the environment more broadly, has become a fundamental part of social reproduction. How am I doing for time, Mika?
Another 7 minutes?
Okay, so I will sort of go through the examples a little bit quickly, but I think that we see then these resistances and agency and this negotiation taking place at multiple levels. So this is again a woman to whom I was very close, and what did happen is they have two children, but then her husband left her and got started living with another woman, but he wanted the land to be divided between the two of them, and she refused. And she then gave different arguments and tried to also get the leaders on her side despite his harassment and so on. So she said that, I've been very faithful to the husband, I have a responsibility to the two children. She brought in the labor argument as well, that I take care of almost the entire process of agriculture, from planting to harvesting. And I think this idea of while the male leaders, the community leaders, they were actually in favor of partition of the land, and she then kind of convinced them, also using threats of the law and saying that, look, you need to support me, these are the various reasons, I've been a good wife, I haven't done anything wrong, and if not, the government or the state is actually giving equal rights. And therefore the community leaders also then took her side, accepting this as a dynamic, as legitimate. um, uh, the other important thing, I think, and I won't have time to go into this, so I'll just skim, but I think, as I said earlier, that even for women, there are both shared interests with their husbands as well as separate interests. And I think there's a lot of work in this in Africa, particularly in the Gambia, the work of Carney and Watts and others. But in India, there's very less. Land is seen as male. But when you look at the land records, which I did, land is also, different qualities of land are listed, from paddy growing dhani lands to badi, which is homestead plots, which are, I mean, legally, all this is part of the male title. But I think when we look at control and who is actually taking decisions, I think we find a variation. And the picture on the left is actually of shifting cultivation on the hill slopes. Again, this is practiced mainly by women. So in fact, that there are both, for the dhani land, both men and women are expected to work on that. This is the main crop, this is seen as the household plot, and so on. But for the second crop, women can grow on their own fields, and if they don't have land, they used to migrate to West Bengal to work, to earn a little bit of wage by transplanting paddy in the fields, particularly in the neighboring districts of Bengal, which gave them little more voice. And of course, now it has completely changed, that women are not moving at all, and all the men are moving. So I think while the context has changed, how far is the women also find that they're not insisting on rights to land as long as they have adequate control over land, because they are keen that men need to provide something to the domestic economy. They need to reciprocate in some ways. Otherwise, women end up managing everything on their own, and they are resisting this too. I mean, this whole feminization discourse is also something that is being resisted by them. So, with the changing political economy, I think I've already mentioned this, that the land is shifting, particularly post 2000. That you have the picture on the top is a lot of land has been converted into stone quarries, and it is technically on lease because Adivasi land cannot be sold. I think there have been different efforts by the government to try and amend the Santhal Pargana Tenancy Act to make land saleable, but there have always been protests. So this is something that has not happened because the Adivasis do fear that if the land is made saleable, then very quickly they will lose it, given their marginality, persistent marginality. So there is, of course, a lot of illegal transfer as gifts. There is these stone quarries where minimum wages are bypassed, mining rules are ignored, and common property, a lot of this rubble is put on common property, so people lose their grazing lands, and agricultural lands become unproductive. And plus, with the cash coming in, the whole social character has changed with increase in violence, increase in alcoholism, and so on. So I think interestingly, I started off that all these men see themselves as chasahor or cultivators. But in 20 years after Jharkhand was formed, we find that Jharkhand has the highest number of migrant labor. In 2018, it was 5 million amongst Indian states. And the there's very little space. The kind of work they do, this boy has come to UP to sugarcane plantations. All these men, some go to Kerala and to the south to work. There's very little scope for upward mobility with the kinds of labor regimes they are working in, because it's low wages, hard, non-stop work, constant mentoring and monitoring, and so on. And I think I find the sort of theorizing of Melassu very useful here, that this kind of migrant labor, it creates a double bind where the employers are able to pay lower wages because they're not paying for the social reproduction of the entire household if it was permanent migration, but they're really being subsidized by the agricultural work which women are doing in the homes. So I think here it was also very important in terms of the stereotypes again, and how the stereotypes are being used to prevent upward mobility. So there were also some educated men within this group who tried to become labor contractors, and one of them said to me that actually I tried for 2 years, but then the employers didn't want to go through me. They preferred a caste person or somebody else. And so this is again the stereotyping of Adivasis as backward, unable to do higher level of jobs, and so on, despite their education. So I'll skip this, but I just put this to say that, the burdens of work, therefore, there are real gender asymmetries which have increased in these areas because of this male migration, particularly with women's work. But also when you come to health and nutrition, you find a real secular decline in dietary diversity scores of Adivasi men in central and eastern India. So I'll kind of skip this, but I think female migration has also doubled, but the choices are very few for women. And as some of the young women said to me in Jharkhand, their choices were either to go for domestic work or to become a nun or to join any of the sort of mission orders, in which case they could become professionals like teachers, nurses, doctors. But then, of course, there was a taboo on marriage unless that changes. So a lot of them go for domestic work. They constantly send money home. But while men are seen as providers and remitters and so on, women's remittances home are seen as gifts, and they're not seen as household provisioning, despite being central to the social reproduction of their households at home. So they then invest, they say that they can't really manage this, so they invest in strategies of building up their own resources, building a house, having a bank account, building their own status and respectability. So I think I'm going to maybe skip this, because I've spoken a bit about this, that while state should be an enabler, but actually it has supported a lot of large corporations in the mining sector, entry of traders and contractors, movement of common property to stone quarrying, and so on. Even when it has tried to provide entitlements, I think it has been at manual jobs. So read is food security under public distribution or manual work under Manrega. No, it's only even they're educated amongst the youth, but it gives them manual jobs. The employment linked is very scarce. Rights are very scarce. So even a lot of women now in public sector jobs as ashas. This woman worked with me. She's an asha worker. There's Anganwadi workers. There's whole set of frontline workers, but they are seen as volunteers. They have no formal benefits or no proper wages. Miss this. And this is really my last slide to conclude, that really how do we think about breaking down some of these stereotypes. While a lot has changed in the context, while a lot has changed in terms of actual roles and relations, I think some of these very rigid stereotypes sort of keep in place inequalities or structural inequalities, like in the case of land, the very immovability of land titles to women. So I think while reciprocity is kind of embedded in Adivasi cultures, even though it's somewhat asymmetric, especially the growing movement of men for survival as footloose migrant workers and women as household managers, it's really creating the need to rethink what reciprocity means, how is it expressed in the context of male absence. Secondly, I think that women continue to be constructed in development policy as wives and mothers, and a lot of the things that they receive from the state are welfare entitlements. How far can equal rights to land and resources be denied? So even now, when you see, you look at Kisan credit cards, these women are all farmers, but only 4% of women have Kisan credit cards. Whereas every state government in India today is outdoing itself to give cash transfers to women as an election gimmick. I mean, it's very interesting that in Tamil Nadu, it seems that women have kind of opposed this a little bit in kind of not voting in any of the parties who were the major political parties in the state, because they really feel that now the time has come that we need to be heard. We can't just be bought off with welfare entitlements. And the final point, which I can talk more about in the discussion, if you like, is my recent work with young people and really, training them in skills, in documentation, use of cameras, voice, mobile phones, and digital technologies. Is really their desire to break out of some of these homogenizing stereotypes, both young men and women. And they really want to see themselves also as equal as citizens, not just as orahod or constrained by domestic. They recognize that there are structural inequalities, but they really are trying now very hard to break some of these homogenizing narratives, to establish the connectedness of land and labor, but also the public and the private in the processes of social reproduction. So thanks very much, Mihika, and sorry if I took a little extra time.
Thank you so much for that. Thanks a lot. And I see that you're not sharing your screen anymore, which is great because in some ways, we really encourage people to raise their hands and unmute themselves and ask questions. So I will move on to the second part of our seminar, which is that, it is now open to discussions. You please do raise your hand and I will chair it. Do introduce yourself. It's a very informal format and we encourage discussions. So with that, who wants to go first? I, of course, am bursting with questions, but I'm going to not abuse my right as chair and see if there are questions. Okay, so while people are gathering their thoughts, I will start with one of my first questions. So that was, of course, I mean, I can just see the temporal quality that you mentioned at the start of your methodology. And so one of the questions I had was all about methods, which is also the spatiality and the aspect of changes in how migration has affected spatial relations in this very long-term project of yours. So how have your methods changed, evolved, particularly as you take into account women who are migrating from Adivasis communities? Has that changed your methods? I see there's a second question. So would you prefer to collect a couple of questions together?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Rahul, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hello, ma'am. I'm
Yeah, hi.
extremely sorry. I'm on a phone, so
No problem.
yeah, I'm a PhD scholar at Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, and in fact, I come from Jharkhand. And just last year, I had a field survey in at the Santhal area in at the Godda district in the Sundar Pahadi block. So I was just able to recall all those things you mentioned. Wanted to ask, in terms of as a land rights, what I understood in that place was that the land was passed through the male of a family to another male. So, but in that context, I saw in the onset of FRA, Forest Rights Act, NGOs in those areas are specifically while as an availing their membership are mentioning the name of the house wives also, and it's a practice which have been going on in this area. So how do you see this act itself, whether it might have the potential to change some uh, uh, land structure and in fact bring reforms in the future? So
Yeah.
just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I think I'll take both these. Maybe I'll start with yours, Rahul. Actually, I'm just working with somebody with one of the land rights movements, Ekta Parishad, on some of the data with FRA. And what we have seen, not in Jharkhand, but we've looked at data from Chhattisgarh, which is a very large sample of about 10,000. Very simple questionnaire was done. But the women who actually have their names included within the land, even within the FRA, in the individual homestead land. So there are two or three types of land within FRA. There's the community land and is not that many. It's about 5 or 10% where women are included. So it's not yet an equal 50-50, though the opportunity is there. So I think some of these sort of inheritance practices are very deep and very firm. But I think it would really be interesting to see, because I do see potential. I think that in the beginning I said that there is, for the Adivasis particularly, a continuum of land. So you are dependent on the forest, you are dependent for certain things, on the even for food. It's not only cultivated food. I think the work that I'm currently doing in Dumka district is that actually we documented during COVID with these cameras and the local youth. When the markets were closed, they went back to consuming a lot of the forest based foods, mushroom, bamboo shoots, very rich in nutrition. And actually, when they don't go to the forest, they use only the market. Then it's only aloo pyaz, which doesn't have much nutrition at all. And I think I didn't go into it, but when we look at diet and dietary diversity for Adivasis, is generally going down. There is a secular decline in India. So I think their traditional lifestyle looked at both these as complementary as forests. So I think forest rights are really important. I think they have a potential. And if NGOs and others can actually work towards getting equal rights, I think it could be transformative actually, because I think the other thing that I wanted to say is that the problem is really with the political, with state and structures. And I've written a little bit about this because I think, especially in the last 20 years, with aspirations going up, you want to send your children to good schools, etc. You need money for everything. Forests have been enclosed, land has been taken away. So this migration of men has increased substantively. One is for in order to live, but also in order to earn cash. Because in the local economy, there's not that much scope for earning cash. So I think what seems to be happening is that at the household level, even though women are not having land titles, but there is much greater cooperation between the migrant man and his wife. And I think this is why I was talking about reciprocity and the need to rethink that, because the man knows that his own identity is damaged. He's no longer Chasahod. He's sitting somewhere in UP or Kerala or wherever doing work, but he still needs to somehow construct his identity in relation to the household as head of the household. And I think therefore a lot of support in terms of letting women take the decisions, or if they say, okay, we don't want to grow this, we want to grow something else, or we want to go take a scheme, or we want to take a loan, or we want to buy some equipment. I think really being very supportive of these decisions. Ultimately, it may get projected as a sort of male decision, as male head of household, but there is a lot which women are initiating at the household level. I think the problem for me now in today's context is really in the case of the structural constraints of the political economy constraints. So, for instance, the RBI rules, they don't allow woman farmer. Only somebody who has land title can be get a Kisan credit card. Woman doesn't have a land title, so she can't get Kisan credit card. And you get stuck. I mean, in Odisha, we tried actually, even in tribal areas, that Odisha has its own. And then, of course, government has all sorts of portal and this and that. For getting PM Kisan, you need to be registered on AgriStack. And without land, women can't be registered. So they can't get PM Kisan. They can't get compensation in the case of, even though they are the ones doing the work. And the husband is sitting somewhere else. So I think there are huge implementation and sort of administrative and structural roadblocks which need somehow to be addressed and to be lifted. And I genuinely feel in today's context, at least in the Santhal Parganas, but also in other parts of India, that, this putting men against women and seeing gender as, the men are not allowing. Yes, it is true that, the men actually, as I said, are flexible. Maybe when it comes to land registration, I don't know, because there's a whole family and kinship involved. I don't know how much they would be. But in Odisha, this is very recent, where we tried, where the husband said they are happy to get their wives registered on the Odisha portal, Krishi portal. But they needed Aadhaar card. Aadhaar card wouldn't match. The name of the husband and the name of the wife wouldn't match. Sometimes the father's name is on the land. Even the husband's name is not on the land. So I think that there is this, you really end up with a massive sort of blockade to trying to address this issue. And, it really needs, I think, some simple solutions. I think some simplification of this from the state and from the RBI, the basic resources, credit. If you see a person as a producer or as a provider, not only giving 2,000 rupees to women as welfare, no, that 2,000 doesn't do anything. Every state government now as an election thing is giving 2,000 rupees for women. Bihar did it, Jharkhand, I mean, every state, Tamil Nadu, I mean, every state. So I think, and women are not wanting that. They are wanting something which really recognizes much more concretely their this. Yeah. Do you want to ask a follow-up question on this? And Mihika, can I come back to you on the speciality? Yeah. Yes, go ahead, Rahul.
Yeah. So, ma'am, as you mentioned about the cash transfer, it has stuck to me. One thing which I found in my field survey among the tribal, cash is the biggest issue. So they in terms of bad harvest, they can rely on forest and forest produce, even send the wood and all. But in terms of buying vegetables or for school fees and all, cash is a big issue. And in terms of cash, this Maya Samman Yojana, in which the Santhal families are getting, I think, 2,000 rupees, the women are getting, and the Pahadiya, the PBTGs are getting, again, above 18 are getting. I found that, I don't know, I didn't as an inquiry about it, but might be they are playing a big role in in terms of increasing the bargaining power of the women, because cash is a big issue and they are the one who are getting it on a monthly basis. I don't know,
So, yes, I think to some extent, I mean, I'm a little bit more skeptical. I mean, yes, bargaining part, they have that cash in hand. I think women are also voting for this because, state has failed in many ways in delivering development to people. So now you feel ki kuch bhi mil jaye, you get anything. and you do with it. And of course, it is useful for sort of immediate needs and so on. It is giving them something directly in a context. Actually, Santhal and in tribal areas, no, women always had cash because they were always going to the market. They were collecting forest produce. So as I said, I didn't have too much time. I was rushing, but the paddy monsoon, they grow the paddy. Then in the second season, amongst the Santals in the winter, because it is not irrigated, those who don't have irrigation, earlier women would go to Bengal to earn wages, to work in harvesting and transplanting, or they do forest produce and they will go to the heart. If you go to the local markets, you will see women selling the seasonal fruit or vegetables or amra, whatever it is, or jackfruit or firewood, if nothing else, or leaf plates in the summer seasons. So I think women always had in these areas a source of cash, and this is where political economy comes in. We have closed the forests, so we don't allow them to go there. You have made it reserved, or you have given it to contractors, or you have denuded the forests into monocropped. In Odisha, I saw, not in Jharkhand, but the whole upper part under Campa, it has gone to paper industry for eucalyptus plantations. So with eucalyptus there, women can't get mushrooms or nothing grows else. So I think that, we really need to see these two in conversation with each other, really as a social ecological system, because there are certain things which state policy has done, like denuding the forest, expanding the villages, population. I understand. No, if I go to Dumka today compared to when I went 30 years ago, the forests have really moved because the city has expanded after it became the Rajdhani, the second capital of Jharkhand. The city has expanded. All the trees, forests near the city have been cut. So I think then you take away sources of income from what women had in terms of forest produce. Because men have to migrate, women can't also leave the home and migrate. So women's migration has really come down. So they don't have a cash. So you create a situation where women's alternate sources, their diversified lower sources of income from forest produce, from wage labor, from migrant labor are all gone. And then you give them cash transfer. So they need cash. I'm not disputing your point, but I think they always earned cash. And today that sources of earning cash have gone, and therefore they're dependent on this state welfare. I think in the north, in the south, in Tamil Nadu is very interesting, where I also did some research, which is not the topic today. But there, because of higher levels of education, more fertility, transition, and so on, actually, I have a PhD student now who's working in Salem in Tamil Nadu, and she was here recently and she doing her field work. And she told me that part of the reason for this Vijay, the actor's victory in Tamil Nadu, is that he was sort of promising the youth that, I will do more for the youth, I will look at your aspirations, I will provide employment, and so on. And she told me in the villages where she is working that a lot of the women who are doing all this kind of low paid job, no, panchayat secretary, pashu sakhi, poshan sakhi, for very peanuts wages. All these women are working in the around about the panchayat, but they all said that, look, we really want to be seen as, proper employees. And if Vijay is willing to promise us that, we are willing to forego the cash transfer. Because even in Tamil Nadu, that Pennurumai, it has made, the cash transfer for women has been going on for a long time. And it is useful. I'm not saying it's not useful. It does give women cash in hand. But I think we need to recognize the larger political economy, where we first taken away the sources that they had and then disempowered them and then giving them something back. So coming to your question, Mihika, I think it's really interesting in terms of spatiality. And of course, spatiality for ethnographic or more qualitative research is much more difficult to handle because you're trying to understand the context and go deep into the context. But what I did try, and I think some of those pictures of the sugarcane and those migrant men was really taken from the destination site. So where the villages where I had been working in the Santhal Parganas, there was a very large number of men from Sahibganj who were going to UP to work in these sugarcane plantations. So at one point, I did find out where they were going through an agent and so on. And I went to the destination villages. It was very difficult to actually do a lot of ethnographic work there because of the labor conditions. So the migrant workers whom I knew in the village, they were not accessible to me. So they were with the Jat or the Muslim employers who are the sugarcane farmers. And I went through contacts and I could talk to them and, the employers, get their perspective. And they told me how nicely they're looking after these people and so on and so forth. But also what happens with migrant workers within the agriculture sector is that they get isolated once they come as a group from the village, but then they're literally living in the house of each of these big employers. And there's another politics there between the local Dalit labor and these Adivasi migrant workers. So while I could, while one way of dealing with speciality, and which I have also tried to go to Kerala, for example, and, see what's happening there. I looked at women working in Delhi. That was again hugely difficult because they go with agencies, and again, it depends very much on their educational status. Those who go through the church, it's easier to trace them and to talk to them. But those who go through other agencies, many are trafficked almost, and you don't know where they are, and the parents don't know where they are, and these agencies, they don't answer your call when you try as a researcher. So I think this whole actually, one of the techniques for educated populations is to look at sort of tracer studies, in terms of careers and where have people moved from universities and so on. Do it in terms of taking on board the spread and the spatiality. I think it's really important, but I think it's very difficult. I think I'm currently working on a project on migration, actually, as adaptation to climate change. We are not looking at Jharkhand, but we're looking at Orissa, and we're looking at Orissa to Kerala migrant corridor. And we have done surveys in both Orissa and in Kerala, but it's very difficult to match the same households. So you get a certain population in Kerala where you can kind of think that, they may be similar households or similar conditions, but you very difficult to actually find the exact uh, same ones. So I think with long-term work, I think trust is there. So the people from the village, they do give me their addresses of where they are going, where they are staying, and so on. But I think it becomes then very small numbers. I mean, one can still do very qualitative work. But of course, the downside of that is, see, dignity. And that is that I found when doing long-term work, and especially ethnographic work, that the households with whom I stayed, some of them were very poor, or the villagers, they were very poor at that time. And I was doing my first when I went. And even now, they go through quite difficult circumstances. Many of them are indebted. And I think, as Rahul was saying, they need cash because something to help them tide over. But they now treat me as a friend or as a guest, so they will never tell me, or none of these people ever asked me for money. And I know that they may be facing difficult circumstances, but I think that kind of a long-term ethnographic relationship, it also then makes people want to always retain certain memories, retain certain dignity, rather than talking about the difficulties or their needs. I mean, they don't want to sound like needy or begging towards me, and they want to have a much more dignified personality. So sometimes when I see them in the destination, they get a bit embarrassed as well to see them, but with the church going girls, it was different because I would meet them at the church. So every Sunday, those who go through the church, the deal is they are domestic workers in Delhi, but Sunday is off day, which is what the church negotiates. And then they come to a church in South Delhi. And so there, it was possible to meet some of them, and that's a neutral space. So then, one can have a conversation without actually seeing what they're doing. So actually, from the women, I did get a lot more insight into the difficulties they confront, how they are treated, etc., compared to the men. I think there's also an issue of masculinity here, vis-a-vis me as a researcher, because even though I may be older or whatever, the men, I think, still feel that, it's below their dignity to kind of say that they are suffering or that they are struggling. So I think it's a very interesting question, and I'm trying to do much more of across space and much more work on migration and looking at the links with landed relations and what's happening to that. Like, do people even care about land anymore? That's again a question that I'm quite interested in. But I think, as I said, because of this, the upward mobility is really stuck. I mean, people are really stuck. Even educated Santals or educated Adivasis are not really able to go above manual labor into higher paid jobs. And I think there is this huge ethnic race, caste, whatever you call it, divide. That why some people are seen as more deserving or more capable than others. And I have seen a lot of these young Adivasi, Santhal boys and girls, very bright, but just not able to get jobs. Even my own research assistant, who's a very dear friend from 25 years ago, she's now in almost 50. But well educated. She'd done her graduation at that time, couldn't find a job as a teacher, couldn't find a job, worked for some time in an NGO, very low paid. Then during COVID, migrated actually to Shimla, to Solan, to work in a factory because her children were growing up and she needed to earn and pay for them. Has come back, now set up a shop. In between was working in a hospital. So you really see that these are very intelligent, very dedicated, very qualified people, but they struggle to make an entry into that system. I mean, the state really is embracing women as all these sakhis and frontline workers, but no, none of them are treated as workers. They do a whole day's work, but they're still treated as part-time volunteers and given some kind of an honorarium. So I think there are real huge issues in terms of how do we deal with some of these things across space. I even think that maybe if the women actually get proper jobs, or these jobs are properly upgraded given the minimum wage, and they are doing that, I think the men can easily stay back and do get into more modernized agriculture, or invest more into irrigation or other kinds of make their land much more productive, because they still take pride in that, as Rahul said.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Nitya. Can you hear me?
Yes. And I think Bhupendra has his hand.
Yes, he has his hand.
Thank you, Nitya, for this interesting, story, and also like the kind of crisis. It is a crisis of not only merely the identity of Adivasi, but also, like, I was just wondering how, despite having this feminization of labor, there's a crisis of social reproductions for Adivasis in this case. And I was just wondering, how do we see the meaning of land, because like, of course, there's a kind of differentiation of land holdings, but then when it comes to the kind of, capitalist development, the political economy of development, which is, also the story of how the landscapes are also transforming into these particular territories, and the identity of Adivasi is also into the kind of very much onto that affronting or confronting the kind of capitalist development. So I was just wondering, how do you see how they are negotiating this in terms of asserting the self sovereignty for Adivasi identity, as that is also quite masculine in a way, as you are rightly portraying, that men are mostly savior or whatever, upholder of this identity, but they are also the ones who are also confronting with this crisis of social reproduction. So then I was just wondering, how do we make sense of these multiple crises, which are not only limited to Adivasis or women, but also in general the society, like underclass society facing today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Actually, when you look at or talk to many of these people, see, I think if, like, when we see in India, let's say 1/6 of the population is migrant or mobile. So I'm not against migration, and I think I'm working on a project where migration can be seen as a form of permanent relocation or adaptation or whatever, which many educated people do into skilled jobs. But I think the people we're talking about, and I think this is really the capitalist inequalities and the issues of the two Indias, if you like, that for them, there is even if they aspire, like, acha, we will go and settle in Delhi or Bombay or Trivandrum, in terms of upward mobility with our families, it's very, very difficult to do it. The kind of jobs they get, working in factories, working as construction labor, manual labor, it's difficult. It's not enough for social reproduction. So I think recently you might have seen in the news that even in Noida or somewhere, the workers, all migrant workers, they actually came out of the factories and they said that this money is not enough for us because it's not even paying for our own expenses. Forget about social reproduction of the household. So remittances really contributes to social reproduction of the households at home. And I think for me, many of the men whom I saw, like in Kerala, in Kochi, where I went, they live in pretty miserable. I mean, they live 3-4 men sharing a room, cooking themselves. They try and save maximum to send money home because they still see their identity, because this identity is so bad. You're just a manual labor. You're a footloose labor. You're not even a proper skilled worker. See, if they got an office job, they could change their identity. But they're not getting that. So the better identity is of a landowner, a cultivator, and they do send every possible money back home to invest in the land. So I think that for Adivasis particularly, that does remain a priority, apart from the other point which I mentioned, that, this for the social reproduction, that land is still very important. Just on the migrant workers' wage, you cannot manage. If the woman really sat down and said, I'm not going to do cultivation, the family will not survive. So I think for food security, even if it's barren land, bad land, at least 40% I found in Santhal Parganas of food is self-cultivated. 40 to 50%, then comes from PDS, and then some you sell and so on to earn cash. So I think there are a couple of things which are very key. One is when you look at Jharkhand history, when we look at the land records from, let's say, 1870s or some of the land revenue settlement surveys, actually there was a lot of water and there were community systems for water management. And actually some of the early land revenue from early 20th century, 1905, they actually say that in these areas, 3 crops were possible. But today, only 1 crop is possible, that is rain-fed. Irrigation has not developed at all. In fact, in my recent work, the panchayat presidents, sarpanches, they've all been saying that water is a big issue, that water scarcity, if we have more water, the land is fine, but without water, we can't cultivate it. So there is an increasing aridity. I mean, otherwise there's enough rainfall, but there's no investment into saving that water, recharging groundwater, maintaining ponds. I mean, there are many technologies now at community level. I think earlier Rahul gave the example of an NGO. I think some NGOs have been doing this, watershed management and so on. But it really needs, I think water is one aspect, at least in Jharkhand and in Santhal Parganas, needs to be addressed. It can really turn around things quite a lot. Second thing is that, as you say, that this approach, that putting cash first, it's a very capitalist development. So I was in December in Ranchi and they were thinking about 25 years of Jharkhand. It was a conference in Ranchi. And the whole vision was about, developing value chains, exporting horticulture, producing and exporting horticulture so that people will have cash. And I think the thinking about your sort of culture and identity or their own well-being, how can we make sure that first priority, along with, which I raised as an issue there, that, alongside value addition and value chains and export of horticulture or export of eggs is very good. But why don't you first give all the children eggs to get over protein inadequacy? Why don't you first ensure that the fruits and vegetables are, given in the midday meal or in the Anganwadi and for home consumption, and then the surplus is sort of taken for value addition and so on. So I think within the planning processes, you're very right in saying that the thinking is all about how can we enhance sort of growth in income terms rather than thinking about overall how are these communities doing? Are they well? What about their well-being? What about their health? So some of the old people, actually, some of the old men told me when we were doing this nutrition work that jab hum chote the, like during our childhood, not that many people fell ill. There was enough to eat. We would just go to the jungle and get fruits. And there was always, children were never hungry. There was hunting that went on. So, and I think today that all that has changed. So I think this, I don't know what is the solution, but I think definitely we need to pay attention on both ends. So we need to make migration more, we need to also argue for, better wages, decent work for migrants, so that if people do want to leave, that's an option for households. But at the same time, we need to argue, for a proper agricultural strategy and development, because land does continue to matter.
Thanks, Nithya. I think
Thank
Deepa
you.
has a question. So, Deepa, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thank you very much, ma'am, for this very fascinating talk. I was curious to know that with an increase in footloose labor and feminization of agriculture, is there an increased risk that Adivasi women face to their lands? Because you mentioned this persistence of witch hunting. So is there is this footloose labor and feminization of agriculture showing trends? Is there a trend of this increasing threat to Adivasi women's lands?
So I think that's a good question, Deepa. I think if you see what happens in Jharkhand, or what has happened even since Jharkhand was formed in the last 20 years, forget about the last 100 years history, but in the last 20 years, especially the previous government before Hemant Soren came, and he tried to reverse it a little bit, but the whole strategy of the state was on sort of urbanization, industrial development, mining development, and so on. A lot of it was around land acquisition. They tried to push through the back way liberalization of the tenancy acts, the Chota Nagpur and the Santhal Pargana tenancy acts, and immediately kind of local people got together and resisted. So I think the awareness is, despite the poverty, lack of education, everything, but I think awareness on land, and land being so central to their identity, I think that awareness, when they see anything like this going wrong, I think in Santhal Parganas, they weren't successfully able to improve to oppose the stone quarries. And for some of the blocks in where this has really taken over, I think the land is completely destroyed. So even though technically it's not sold, it's still in their names, but it's been leased out for 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is. But that land will never become cultivable again. And I think people have seen it. And people are learning it. People are living with the pollution which comes from this quarries and the sand mining, lack of protective gear. That whole area is kind of transformed for the negative. So I think, and also for women, I think women are very aware of this and do very actively take part in some of this resistance. But I don't think because of feminization there is a threat to the land, because I think with feminization, I think that for me is the interesting part, that men have become much more possessive about the land with the actual feminization, because they've lost their identity as footloose labor. There's nothing that they can be proud of. So they in fact are more keen to maintain that they retain control over this land. So once a year, they will come during harvest festival. They will come during, for plowing the land, for example, in August. A lot of these migrant labor, if they can, not the ones very far, but the ones who are closer by, they do try and come home to assert that no, we are still involved with the land. And they see land, in fact, more so as a much more respectable profession than what they're actually doing. So I think there's an interesting paradox there.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Deepa. Go ahead. Were you just saying thanks?
I mean, yeah, because of that the paradox was between the feminine. That was something that I had not thought about. That that there is this the kind of identity that Adivasi communities also derive from land is also central to their.
And I think that's one of the reasons, perhaps, that despite women doing now 90% or even 100% of the agricultural work, except, as I said, plowing, and men come during certain times, the inclusion of women in land revenue titles, or so that they can also get benefits of credit and be more independent in decision making and so on. I think that you could see it as a continuing form of subordination, but I also see it as a process where these reciprocal relations are being renegotiated. I think where both are pushing and trying to see, where is it going to land. So I think it's still a very dynamic process.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm conscious of time, but I do see there's another hand. Ms. Ink, do you want to quickly ask your question? And then Nitya, you'll have 2 minutes to answer, and then I will say my thanks. So, Ms. Ink, over to you. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello. So, question was regarding land. So, in the present context of Indian agriculture and how marginalization of land has been the key, phenomenon which has been happening. So, how do you see land as this, a provider for social, reproduction? If I am getting that question correct. So, and the other question is regarding labor, where women from, tribal hinterlands, they migrate, but, those who migrate, especially those women who do not have credible education, which will provide them or push them into, getting the kind of jobs in the new economy. They generally, especially in cities like Delhi, and I know of community members, of my community members, women who generally migrate to cities in Delhi or any other metro cities, and they work as, what do I say? Maids, So, I mean, yeah, you were right in that. Yeah.
So I think, yes, especially for the live-in domestic workers or live-in maids in these metro cities. And I think that goes back to stereotypes. I think there's a great preference for Adivasis because somehow Adivasis are seen as, simple, backward. So these things stick. So I may not trust, if I may not want a Marwadi or somebody who's seen as sharp, I may not want that person as a domestic worker in my house, especially a live-in maid. But I want a simple person who's obedient, who you could even, she's adult, but you can treat her like a child and so on. So I think these stereotypes lead to particular sectors as well of labor being masculinized or feminized, and domestic work clearly is one that, again, men are seen as a bit of a threat because often it's women in the home, so you don't want man as a servant or as a domestic worker. So, and especially for live-in, I have seen definitely in Delhi in my work that there's a preference for Adivasi women over other women, caste women, because Adivasi women somehow are seen to be purer or simpler, or they come from remote areas, they're not corrupted. So there's a whole kind of stereotyping of simpleton or simplicity that is associated with this. So yes, so I think, and as I said, their choices are very limited. I mean, even now, it was a shock to me when I went to the school. I was talking to the teacher of a residential girls' school, and she was herself an Adivasi in Simdega, and she was the principal of the school. It was a mission school, but she said that there are these two choices for girls: either you become domestic worker or you become nun. So she had got, and these nuns, I mean, these missions, they come for recruitment of girls when they are in their 11th and 12th. So if you choose that, then you can get a very good professional career. Like this lady herself, with whom I was saying, the principal of the school. I mean, she's the principal of the school. And she comes from that background and that location. But of course, then she has joined the order. So she can't have a family life, and things like that. So I think there's it's very stark, the trade-off, especially for Adivasi women. I think there's a segregation that takes place for women in general, but it's much more so for Adivasis. Similarly, from the Northeast, they are seen as sort of dominating the beauty business, for example. And you would prefer to go to a beauty parlor, whether you're in Chennai or Delhi or Mumbai, where there is a Northeast woman there rather than a local. So I think these are stereotypes of what it means to be modern, what it means, and they do some work in terms of the opportunities, but also the structural barriers. And I think that was one of my main arguments, that how young people actually want to now try to come out of some of these stereotypes, which are structural, and but structural at many levels. It's not only the state, but it's also the political economy at the community level, at the state level. And really the difficulties in overcoming some of these, even with modern education, of overcoming some of these stereotypes and some of these structural barriers. And land, yes, I think land, I think for them, I think it's really an identity question. I think it's not really about how much does it produce, how much yields. I think this is the way policy making looks at it, that are you growing high yielding, how many hectares, how many tons. But I think that's important. I think a lot of them do want enough produce and to increase their produce. But I think at the same time, it also does the work in terms of a class positioning. I mean, it does land works in terms of identity in many subtle ways. It works in terms of status. You're seen as a landowner. Even if you have half an acre of land, you're not a landless. So I think it performs certain functions which are social and symbolic as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nithya. That was fascinating, and you've given us a lot of different, things to think about in terms of the complexities and the negotiations across land, labor, migration, space, time, different and overlapping crises within masculinity, but also feminization of different aspects of social reproduction realms. So thank you for helping us think through not just all of these analytical issues, but also methods. So with that, we wrap up our series, webinar series for the DSA-EAD working group, and we will reconvene in the new academic year. So if you could join me in thanking Nithya for that wonderful talk. Thank you so much again, Nithya, for your time, and thank you all for contributing to our webinar series. And some of you have come multiple times, so I take it as a sign that we must continue.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nithya, Mehika, and Rama.
Thank you so much
for making this
possible.
possible.
Thank you all. Yeah, really enjoyed the discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. This was
Looking
wonderful.
forward for the next time. Bye bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.